Speech by Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov in the open debate of the debate on effective multilateralism through respect for the principles of the UN Charter, New York, the 24th of April 2023. April 2023.
I will now make a statement in my capacity as Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation. Dear Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, it is symbolic that we are holding our meeting on the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace, which was established by a UN General Assembly resolution on the 12th of December 2018. December 2018 into the calendar of anniversaries. In a fortnight time, we will mark the 78th anniversary of victory in the Second World War. Anniversary of victory in the Second World War. The defeat of Nazi Germany, to which my country made a decisive contribution with the support of the Allies, laid the foundation for the post-war international order. The United Nations Charter provided the legal basis, and our organization, embodying true multilateralism, assumed a central coordinating role in world politics. In the more than 80 years of its existence, the UN has fulfilled the crucial task entrusted to it by its founding fathers. For decades, the basic understanding of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council on the primacy of the goals and principles of the Charter has ensured global security, and thus created the conditions for truly multilateral cooperation guided by universally accepted norms of international law. Today, the UN-centric system is in deep crisis. The cause is the desire of some members of our organization to replace international law and the UN Charter with a kind of rules-based order. These rules have not been seen. They have not been the subject of transparent international negotiations. They are invented and applied to counter the natural process of the formation of new independent centers of development, which is the objective manifestation of multilateralism. Attempts are made to contain them through unlawful unilateral measures, such as cutting off access to modern technologies and financial services, squeezing them out of supply chains, confiscating property, destroying critical infrastructure of competitors, manipulating universally agreed norms and procedures. The result is the fragmentation of world trade, the breakdown of market mechanisms, the paralysis of the World Trade Organization, and the final undisguised transformation of the IMF into an instrument to achieve the goals of the US and its allies, including with military aid. In a desperate attempt to assert its supremacy by punishing the disobedient, the US has destroyed globalization, which for years was hailed as the highest good of humanity and served the multilateral system of the world economy. Washington and the rest of the West, subjected to it, enforce their rules whenever they have to justify illegitimate steps against those who bring their policies in line with international law and refuse to follow the interests of the golden billion. Dissenters are blacklisted according to the principle, whoever is not with us is against us. It has long been inconvenient for their Western counterparts to agree in universal formats like the UN. The issue where democracies gang up against autocracies was introduced to ideologically undermine multilateralism. In addition to summits for democracy, whose members are determined by the self-proclaimed hegemon, other clubs of the chosen are created to bypass the UN. Summits for Democracy, Alliance for Multilateralism, Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, Global Coalition for Media Freedom, Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. All these and other non-integrative projects aim to undermine negotiations on relevant issues under the auspices of the UN and impose non-consensual concepts and solutions that benefit the West. First, you agree on something in a small circle and then present these agreements as the position of the international community. Let's call a spade a spade. No one has allowed the Western minority to speak on behalf of all humanity. We must behave with decency and respect all members of the international community. By imposing a rules-based order, its authors arrogantly reject the most important principle of the UN Charter, the sovereign equality of states. The quintessence of exclusivism was EU diplomatic chief Jay Borrell's proud statement that Europe is a Garden of Eden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I would like to quote the NATO-EU joint statement of the 10th of January, which says, "The United West will use all economic, financial, political, and, I stress, military instruments at the disposal of NATO and the EU to safeguard the interests of our 1 billion." The collective West has set out to let multilateralism reshape its interests at the regional level. Not long ago, the U.S. called for a revival of the Monroe Doctrine and required Latin American countries to limit relations with the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. However, this line clashes with the determination of the countries in the region to strengthen their own multilateral structures, especially the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States (CELAC, and to defend their legitimate right to establish themselves as one of the pillars of a multipolar world. Russia wholeheartedly supports these just aspirations. The U.S. and its allies are currently making significant efforts to promote multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. In the Asia-Pacific region, where a successful open system of economic and security cooperation has existed for decades. Economic and security cooperation has developed for decades around the community of Southeast Asian states. This system has facilitated consensus approaches suitable for both the community of Southeast Asian states and its dialogue partners, including Russia, the PRC, the U.S., India, Japan, Australia, and the Republic of Korea, and represents genuine inclusive multilateralism. With the Indo-Pacific strategies, Washington has set out to dismantle this established architecture. At the Madrid summit last year, NATO, which had always asserted its peacefulness and the exclusively defensive nature of its military programs, declared global responsibility and the indivisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the so-called Indo-Pacific region. That is, NATO's line of defense as a defense alliance is now shifting to the western shores of the Pacific. Bloc-based approaches that undermine ASEAN-centric multilateralism are evident in the creation of the AUKUS military alliance, into which Tokyo, Seoul, and a number of ASEAN states are being pushed. Under the aegis of the U.S., mechanisms are being created to interfere in maritime security issues to secure the West's unilateral interests in the waters of the South China Sea. Yesterday, Jay Borrell, whom I have already quoted, promised to send European Union naval forces to this region. No secret is made of the fact that Indo-Pacific strategies are aimed at containing China and isolating Russia. This is how the Western partners understand effective multilateralism in the APAC region. After the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact organization and the demise of the Soviet Union, the hope of realizing genuine multilateralism without dividing lines in the Euro-Atlantic area sprouted. But instead of unleashing the potential of the OSCE on an equal collective basis, the Western countries not only clung to NATO, but, contrary to their promises, began an unabashed takeover of the neighboring space, including areas where vital Russian interests had always existed and would also continue to exist. The then U.S. Secretary of State, Jay Baker, reported to President Bush Sr., "The greatest threat to NATO is the OSCE. I would add that today both the UN and the requirements of its charter are a threat to Washington's global ambitions." Russia has patiently tried to reach mutually beneficial multilateral agreements based on the principle of the indivisibility of security, solemnly proclaimed at the highest level in the documents of the 1999 and 2010 OSCE summits. It states in black and white that no one may strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others, and that no state, group of states or organization can be given primary responsibility for maintaining peace in the OSCE area or consider any part of the OSCE area as its sphere of influence. NATO has ignored these commitments by the presidents and prime ministers of its member states and has begun to do just the opposite, proclaiming its right to any arbitrary power. A glaring example is the lawless bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 with, among other things, depleted uranium munitions, which resulted in a drastic outbreak of cancer, both among Serbian citizens and NATO military personnel. Joe Biden was a senator at the time and said, not without pride, on camera that he had personally called for the bombing of Belgrade and the destruction of all bridges over the Drina River. Now the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, Kay Hill, is calling on the Serbs through the media to turn the page and stop being offended. The United States has had rich experience in stopping being offended. Japan has long been coy about who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not a word about it in school textbooks. Recently, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken smugly lamented the suffering of the victims of these bombings at the G7 meeting, but managed not to mention who organized them. Those are the rules, and no one dares to contradict them. Since the Second World War, there have been dozens of criminal military adventures by Washington without any attempt to secure multilateral legitimacy. Why, when there are rules that nobody knows about? The shameful invasion of Iraq by the U.S.-led coalition in 2003 was carried out in violation of the UN Charter, as was the aggression against Libya in 2011, resulting in the destruction of statehood, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and rampant terrorism. U.S. interference in the affairs of post-Soviet states was a gross violation of the UN Charter. The color revolutions in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and the bloody coup in Kiev in February 2014 were organized. This also includes the attempts to take power by force in Belarus in 2020. The Anglo-Saxons, who confidently lead the entire West, not only justify all these criminal adventures, but also boast about their line of democracy promotion. But again, according to their rules, Kosovo recognize independence without a referendum. Crimea don't recognize even though there was a referendum. Falklands, Malvinas don't touch. There was a referendum there, as British Foreign Secretary Jay Cleverly said recently. This is ridiculous. To avoid double standards, we call on all to be guided by the consensual agreements reached under the 1970 United Nations Declaration on Principles of International Law, which is still in force. The need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of those states that respect the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples and have governments representative of all human beings living within their territory is clearly stated there. It is obvious to any unbiased observer that the Nazi regime in Kiev can in no way be seen as representing the inhabitants of the territories that refused to accept the results of the bloody coup d'etat of February 2014, and against whom the coup plotters unleashed a war to do so. Nor can Pristina claim to represent the interests of the Kosovo Serbs to whom the EU has promised autonomy, just as Berlin and Paris have promised special status to the Donbass. The result of these promises is well known. Our Secretary-General A. Guterres put it well in his speech at the Second Summit for Democracy on the 29th of March this year. Democracy has its origin in the UN Charter. Its first words, "We the peoples," reflect the fundamental source of legitimate might, the consent of those who govern. Consent. Let me emphasize this once again. In order to end the war triggered by the coup in eastern Ukraine, multilateral efforts were made to find a peaceful solution, resulting in a Security Council resolution unanimously endorsing the Minsk agreements. These agreements were trampled underfoot by Kiev and its Western masters, who themselves recently cynically and even proudly admitted that they never intended to implement them, but only wanted to buy time to pump up Ukraine with weapons against Russia. This was a public declaration of a violation of the multilateral obligation of all UN members enshrined in the UN Charter according to which all countries must abide by Security Council resolutions. Our consistent measures to avoid confrontation, including Russian President Vladimir Putin's December 2021 proposal to negotiate multilateral mutual security guarantees, were arrogantly dismissed. No one, we are told, can prevent NATO from including Ukraine in its embrace. In all the years since the 2014 coup d'etat, despite our persistent demands, none of the Western masters of the Kiev regime snarled at Poroshenko, Zelensky, or the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine when the Russian language, education, media, and, more generally, Russian cultural and religious traditions were successively destroyed by legislation, in direct violation of the Ukrainian constitution and universal conventions on the rights of national minorities. At the same time, the Kiev regime introduced the theory and practice of National Socialism into legislation and everyday life. It did not hesitate to organize lavish torchlight processions under the banners of SS divisions in the center of Kiev and other cities. The West kept silent and rubbed its hands. What happened corresponded fully to the U.S. plans to use the blatantly racist regime it had built in the hope of weakening Russia, in line with its strategic course of eliminating competitors and undermining any scenarios involving the imposition of fair multilateralism in world affairs. Today it is clear to everyone, even if not everyone says it out loud, it is not about Ukraine at all, but about how international relations are further shaped by building a sustainable consensus based on a balance of interests, or by aggressively and explosively promoting hegemony. The Ukrainian question cannot be considered in isolation from the geopolitical context. Multilateralism, as already mentioned, presupposes respect for the UN Charter in all its interrelated principles. Russia has clearly stated the objectives of its special military operation: to eliminate the threat to our security posed by NATO directly on our borders for years, and to protect the human beings deprived of their rights under the multilateral conventions from the direct threats of extermination and expulsion from the territories where their ancestors have lived for centuries, which the Kiev regime has publicly pronounced. We have been honest about what and who we are fighting for. In contrast, against the background of the hysteria generated by the USA and the European Union, one would like to ask, what did Washington and NATO do in Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya? Were there threats to their security, culture, religion, languages? What multilateral norms guided them when they declared Kosovo independent in defiance of OSCE principles, when they destroyed the stable, economically prosperous states of Iraq and Libya 10,000 miles from American shores? The multilateral system is threatened by the shameless attempts of Western states to subjugate the secretariats of the UN and other international institutions. There has always been a quantitative imbalance in favor of the West, but until recently the Secretariat has tried to remain neutral. Today, this imbalance has become chronic, and Secretariat staff are increasingly engaging in politically motivated behavior that is inappropriate for international officials. We call on the esteemed Secretary-General Guterres to ensure that all his staff adhere to the requirements of impartiality under Article 100 of the UN Charter. We also appeal to the leadership of the Secretariat to be guided by the need to propose to member countries how consensus and balance of interests can be found instead of adopting neoliberal concepts when drafting initiative documents on the above-mentioned common agenda and a new agenda for peace. Otherwise, instead of a multilateral agenda, the gap between the golden billion and the global majority will be deepened. When talking about multilateralism, one must not limit oneself to the international context, just as one must not ignore the international context when talking about democracy. There must be no double standard. Multilateralism and democracy must be respected both within states and in their relations with each other. Everyone knows that the West, which imposes its understanding of democracy on others, does not want democratization of international relations based on respect for the sovereign equality of states. But while imposing its rules on the international stage, it stifles multilateralism and democracy at home by using ever more repressive means to suppress any dissent, just like the criminal regime in Kiev, which is supported by its teachers, the USA, and its allies. Dear colleagues, once again, as during the Cold War, we have reached a dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous frontier. The situation is exacerbated by the loss of confidence in multilateralism, when the West's financial and economic aggression undoes the benefits of globalization, when Washington and its allies abandon diplomacy and demand clarification of relations on the battlefield. And all this within the walls of the UN, which was founded to prevent the horrors of war. The voices of responsible and reasonable forces, the call for political wisdom, the revival of the culture of dialogue are drowned out by those who want to undermine the basic principles of interstate communication. We all need to return to the origins, to the goals and principles of the UN Charter in all its diversity and interconnectedness. Genuine multilateralism today requires the UN to adapt to the objective trends towards a multipolar architecture of international relations. The reform of the Security Council should be accelerated by increasing the representation of Asian, African, and Latin American countries. The current overrepresentation of the West in this most important UN body undermines the principle of multilateralism. At the initiative of Venezuela, the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations was created. We call on all states that respect the Charter to join it. It is also important to use the constructive potential of the BRICS and the SCO. The EAEC, the CIS, and the CSTO are ready to contribute. We are in favor of using the initiative of regional groupings of countries in the Global South. The G20 can also play a useful role in sustaining multilateralism if the Western participants stop distracting their colleagues from the urgent issues on their agenda in the hope of displacing their responsibility for the accumulation of crisis phenomena in the global economy. It is our collective responsibility to preserve the United Nations as a forged model of multilateralism and global policy coordination. The key to success lies in cooperation, in renouncing claims to exclusivity, and, I repeat, in respecting the sovereign equality of states. This is what we all committed to when we ratified the UN Charter. For 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed to convene a summit of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. The leaders of China and France have supported this initiative, but unfortunately, it has not yet been implemented. This issue is directly related to multilateralism, not because the five powers have some kind of privilege over the others, but precisely because of their special responsibility to maintain international peace and security in accordance with the UN Charter. This is what the imperatives of the UNO-centric system, which is crumbling before our eyes due to the behavior of the West, demand. Concern about this state of affairs is growing in the many initiatives and ideas of the Global South, from East and Southeast Asia, the Arab world and the Muslim world at large, to Africa and Latin America. We appreciate their sincere desire to find a solution to the problems of our time through honest collective work aimed at harmonizing the balance of interests based on the sovereign equality of states and the indivisibility of security. Finally, I would like to address all journalists who are now covering our meeting. Your colleagues from the Russian media were not allowed in. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow mockingly told them that the moment our plane takes off, they will be ready to receive passports with visas. So a big request to you. Make up for the absence of the Russian journalists. Try to shape your reporting in such a way that it conveys the full diversity of judgments and assessments to a global audience.